If you look at me, cowboy, you'll leave like the others." The woman's voice barely rose above the crackling fire, yet the words settled into Elias Mercer's chest heavier than wet earth on a grave. Outside, desert wind scraped against the cabin walls hard enough to rattle the lantern hanging beside the window. The storm had rolled across the Arizona territory just after sundown, carrying dust thick as chimney smoke, and somewhere out beyond the darkness, thunder moved low across the mountains like distant wagon wheels. Elias stood near the iron stove, one rough hand resting against the table while rainwater dripped slowly from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floorboards. He had spent 12 years alone on this ranch, 12 years learning that silence was safer than people, but the Apache woman sitting near his fire had already disturbed that silence more in 3 days than the world had managed in a decade. Nayeli kept her face turned away from him as she sat wrapped tightly in one of his wool blankets. Firelight danced across the side of her cheek, revealing exhaustion beneath the dust and fever. Her dark hair hung damp against her shoulders, and every few seconds, her fingers tightened around the fabric near her throat as though she feared even the air itself might expose something she couldn't survive being seen. Elias remembered the moment he found her, nearly 20 miles north of Black Creek, half buried in blowing sand beside a dead horse whose saddle still carried military markings faded by sun and time. Most folks would have ridden past. Trouble wore too many faces out here, and lonely men didn't stay alive by inviting strangers into their homes. But when Elias saw her kneeling in the dirt with trembling hands, trying to bury something beneath the desert before collapsing from fever, he couldn't leave her there. Even now, he could still picture the object slipping from her hand before she lost consciousness. A burned wedding ring wrapped inside black cloth. Not gold, not money, something far heavier. The woman shifted near the fire and winced softly, one hand pressing against her shoulder beneath the blanket. Elias noticed she always did that, whenever he looked too closely, like she carried pain in places no doctor could stitch closed. "You should rest," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough from disuse, like old leather pulled too tight. Nayeli gave a faint shake of her head. "Rest brings dreams." The answer lingered between them while the storm groaned outside. Elias studied her carefully without making it obvious. She never stepped into sunlight, never removed the blanket completely. Even during fever, she guarded herself with the desperation of someone protecting more than skin. Town folks had already started whispering after spotting her near his wagon 2 days ago. Said Elias Mercer had brought home an Apache witch from the desert. Said no decent woman hid her face that way. But Elias had seen fear before. Real fear. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It sat quietly beside a fire and waited for footsteps that might never stop coming. A sharp gust slammed against the cabin, causing the lantern flame to flicker wildly. Nayeli startled hard enough for the blanket to slip slightly from her shoulder, and for one brief second, Elias saw it. A thin line of scarred skin stretching beneath her collarbone, pale and uneven beneath the firelight. Nayeli grabbed the blanket back instantly, breathing uneven now, eyes wide with something deeper than embarrassment. "Shame. Don't," she whispered. "Please." Elias looked away immediately, his jaw tightening beneath the shadow of his beard. He could have asked questions, could have demanded answers, but something about the way she held herself told him the truth would arrive eventually on its own, same as storms crossing open country. Slow, heavy, impossible to stop. Then, from somewhere outside beyond the wind and rain, came the distant sound of hoofbeats climbing the muddy trail toward the ranch. The hoofbeats came slow at first, almost swallowed by the storm, but Elias Mercer had spent too many winters alone in these hills to mistake the sound of riders approaching after midnight. He reached for the rifle hanging beside the door while the lantern light trembled against the cabin walls. Across the room, Nayeli froze near the fire. Not startled, not confused, afraid. The kind of fear that arrives before danger does. Her fingers tightened around the blanket at her throat, so hard her knuckles turned pale beneath the firelight. Then another sound drifted through the rain, metal jingling softly against saddle leather. More than one horse. Elias stepped toward the window and lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see through the storm. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Dark outlines moving through blowing dust near the fence line. They had not come by accident. Men did not climb 10 muddy miles into the mountains during weather like this unless they were hunting something worth finding. Behind him, he heard the sharp scrape of wood. He turned fast enough to see Nayeli gripping the edge of the table to steady herself, her breathing suddenly uneven. "Do not let them see me," she whispered. Elias looked at her carefully. The fear in her eyes was deeper now, old and buried, like something carried across years instead of miles. "You know them?" he asked quietly. She did not answer right away. Instead, she stared toward the door as another gust of wind rattled the cabin hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. "I know men like them," she finally said. Outside, one of the horses snorted in the cold rain. Then came a knock against the door. Slow, heavy, confident. Elias rested one hand near his revolver but did not reach for it yet. Violence out here usually started with fear, and fear often started with men talking too loud. Another knock came, louder this time. Nayeli stepped backward into the darker corner of the cabin near the stove, pulling the blanket tighter around herself until only her eyes remained visible above the fabric. Elias noticed something then. She was trembling, but not from fever. He opened the door halfway. Rain blew immediately into the cabin, carrying the smell of wet leather, mud, and horse sweat. 3 men sat mounted beneath the storm clouds, their hats dripping water onto heavy canvas coats. The oldest rider had gray whiskers and sharp eyes that moved past Elias too quickly, scanning the inside of the cabin before returning to him. "Evening," the man said. "Weather is ugly enough to drown a preacher. Tonight." Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Then I suppose you better say what you came to say." The rider smiled faintly, though it never touched his eyes. "We are looking for a woman. Apache, traveling alone. Sick, maybe wounded. She passed through Black Creek 2 days ago." Silence settled between them while rain tapped softly against the porch roof. Elias could feel Nayeli standing motionless behind him without even looking back. The rider studied Elias carefully. "You seen anyone like that?" Elias answered without hesitation. "Only thing I have seen all week is bad weather and hungry coyotes." One of the younger riders shifted uneasily in the saddle. "We heard a rancher hauled somebody out of the desert north of town," he muttered. The older man silenced him with a glance before returning his attention to Elias. "If you do happen across her," he said slowly, "you ought to know she is dangerous." Elias almost laughed at that. Dangerous people usually arrived loud, armed, and certain of themselves. The woman hiding behind his stove looked nothing like danger. She looked like someone who had spent too long running from it. The rider tipped his hat once. "Sorry to bother you, mister." Then his eyes drifted past Elias again toward the dark interior of the cabin. For one brief second, the storm light flashed across Nayeli's silhouette near the fire. The old rider's expression changed immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. The old rider kept staring into the cabin long after the rain should have forced his eyes away. Elias Mercer felt it immediately, that strange shift in the air when recognition passes between people without a single word spoken aloud. Behind him, the fire cracked softly, and somewhere near the stove, Nayeli stopped breathing altogether. The rider's horse shifted beneath him while muddy rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat. "You sure you are alone out here?" he asked quietly. Elias did not move from the doorway. "You calling me a liar?" The younger rider beside the old man straightened in the saddle, nervous fingers brushing the edge of his coat. Men like him always looked uncomfortable around silence. The older rider was different, calm, patient, dangerous in the way winter storms were dangerous. "No offense meant," the rider replied. "Just figured a man living this far from town might appreciate knowing who passes through his land." Elias glanced once toward the dark hills behind them where lightning flickered pale against the mountains. "Then you know now? Nobody passed through here tonight." The old rider studied him another long second before finally nodding. "Fair enough." He pulled lightly on the reins, but before turning away, his eyes drifted once more toward the cabin interior. "If you see her," he said, "tell her some ghosts are not worth running from forever." Then the riders disappeared slowly into the storm, their horses fading into rain and darkness until only the distant sound of hoofbeats remained beneath the thunder. Elias shut the door carefully and slid the heavy wooden lock into place. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than before. Hotter too. Firelight rolled softly across the walls while rain whispered against the roof overhead. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he turned around. Naeli still stood near the stove wrapped tightly in the blanket, but now her face had lost what little color remained beneath the fever. She looked toward the door like she expected those men to walk back through it at any moment. Elias removed his hat slowly and hung it beside the window. You know him? It was not a question. Naeli lowered her eyes toward the floorboards. Long ago. Her voice sounded distant, almost hollow. Elias waited, but no explanation followed. That was another thing he had noticed about her. She answered only the part of a question she could survive answering. Nothing more. He walked toward the stove and poured water from the kettle into a tin cup. Steam rose into the dim cabin air, carrying the faint smell of sage leaves he had dropped into the pot earlier. When he handed her the cup, their fingers brushed for half a second. Naeli flinched instantly, not violently, just enough for him to notice. Shame crossed her face right after. Elias pretended not to see either reaction. You do not ask much, she said quietly after a moment. Elias leaned one shoulder against the wall near the lantern. People usually tell the truth faster when they are not cornered. Something in her expression shifted at that. Small, almost invisible, like warmth returning to frozen hands. Outside, thunder rolled lower now as the storm began drifting east across the valley. Naeli stared down into the steaming cup resting between her palms. The old man, she finally whispered, used to wear a cavalry coat before he became a bounty hunter. Elias felt his jaw tighten slightly. Frontier towns were full of former soldiers carrying old wars inside them. Some drank their memories away. Others sold them for money. Did he hurt you? The question escaped before Elias could stop it. Naeli looked up sharply. For one brief second, real fear crossed her face again, but it was not fear of the rider. It was fear of the answer itself. She slowly shook her head once. No, she said softly. Then she looked back into the fire. He only watched. The words settled heavily inside the cabin while wind hissed softly through the cracks in the walls. Elias did not fully understand what she meant yet, but every instinct he had learned surviving the frontier told him one thing clearly. Whatever happened to this woman had begun long before the desert, long before the fever, and long before she arrived at his door carrying that burned wedding ring wrapped in black cloth. Morning arrived slowly over the mountains, gray lights spilling across the valley while rainwater dripped from the cabin roof in soft, steady rhythms. Elias Mercer had already been awake for an hour, standing near the horse trough with his sleeves rolled past his forearms, breaking thin ice from the water with the handle of a shovel. The storm had left the ranch soaked and cold, but the silence afterward felt stranger than the storm itself. Usually, mornings out here belonged to wind, cattle, and the lonely creak of old wood settling beneath the sun. Now every sound seemed sharper because another person breathed beneath his roof. Elias carried a bucket toward the barn just as the cabin door opened behind him. Naeli stepped outside carefully, still wrapped in the dark wool blanket though the rain had stopped. Morning light touched the edge of her face, and Elias noticed she lowered her eyes immediately, turning slightly away from the sun as if daylight itself made her uneasy. Most people moved toward warmth without thinking. She moved like someone trying not to be seen. Elias pretended not to notice. That was becoming a habit around her. The horses shifted softly inside the barn when he entered. Dust floated through narrow beams of pale light cutting between the wooden boards. Naeli stopped near the doorway instead of coming fully inside. Her eyes moved slowly across the stable, studying every corner before settling on the old bay mare chewing lazily near the far stall. She favors her left leg, Naeli said quietly. Elias glanced toward the horse. Cold weather bothers the knee. Naeli nodded once. She carried heavy riders before you owned her. Elias looked at her more carefully then. You know horses? A faint shadow of expression crossed her face, almost a smile, though sadness rested beneath it. My father bred Apache runners near the White Mountains, she said. Before soldiers came. The words drifted away before he could ask anything more. She always did that. Opened a door just wide enough for him to glimpse the past, then closed it again before he could step through. Elias continued spreading hay while the mare nudged softly against Naeli's shoulder. To his surprise, the woman relaxed slightly beneath the horse's breath. Animals trusted people faster than humans did, and somehow that mattered to him. She likes you, Elias muttered. Naeli rested one careful hand against the mare's neck. Animals do not care about scars. The sentence landed quietly between them. Elias lowered the pitchfork slowly. For a second, neither moved. Dust drifted lazily through the barn, while somewhere outside, wind stirred across wet grass. Nayeli seemed to realize what she had said and immediately pulled the blanket tighter around herself again. The wall returned. Elias saw it happen in real time. One moment, she stood there almost peaceful. The next, she looked ready to disappear back into silence forever. Before he could speak, voices echoed faintly from the road below the ranch. Men laughing, wagon wheels grinding through mud. Nayeli stiffened instantly. The warmth vanished from her face like a lantern blown dark. She stepped backward until her shoulders nearly touched the barn wall. Elias walked toward the open doorway and spotted 2 supply wagons climbing the trail from town, carrying lumber and feed sacks. Just merchants. Nothing more. Still, Nayeli kept her eyes fixed downward while the wagons passed. One of the men called out a greeting toward the ranch, but she turned away completely before they could see her face. Elias watched her carefully after the wagons disappeared beyond the hill. "They are gone," he said softly. Nayeli nodded, though her hands still trembled slightly beneath the blanket. Then Elias noticed something near the edge of her sleeve. Thin marks crossing her wrist. Old. Faded. Not fresh enough to tell a story clearly, but enough to explain why crowds frightened her more than storms. She saw him looking and immediately pulled the blanket lower. Shame again. Always shame. Elias hated that word more every day he spent near her. He leaned quietly against the barn door and stared out across the wet valley. "You know," he said after a long silence, "this ranch has not had company in 12 years. Nayeli looked at him carefully. "Why?" Elias watched clouds dragging slowly across the mountains. "Because people usually leave." The answer surprised her. He could see it in her eyes. Then, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Nayeli stepped one pace closer to him instead of farther away. The sun disappeared early behind heavy winter clouds, turning the valley silver long before evening settled across the ranch. Elias Mercer sat near the porch steps repairing an old saddle strap, while cold wind carried the smell of wet cedar down from the mountains. Somewhere inside the cabin, he could hear soft movement from the kitchen stove, dishes shifting quietly against wood. Strange how quickly another person's presence changed a place. For 12 years, silence had lived here like a permanent guest. Now even the smallest sounds carried warmth. Elias pulled the leather tighter through the buckle. Just as the cabin door opened behind him, Nayeli stepped onto the porch wrapped in the same dark blanket she always carried around her shoulders. But tonight something was different. She was not hiding her face. Not completely. Firelight from the cabin brushed softly against her skin while the cold evening wind moved loose strands of dark hair across her cheek. Elias looked up only briefly before returning his attention to the saddle strap. He had learned she trusted him more when he did not stare. Nayeli lowered herself carefully onto the opposite side of the porch. The old wood creaked beneath her weight, while somewhere far across the valley, a coyote called into the fading light. For a while neither of them spoke. That silence no longer felt sharp between them. It felt tired, honest, like 2 people resting beside the same fire after a long ride through bad country. Then Nayeli finally broke it. "Why did your people stop looking at you?" Elias' hands slowed against the leather. He leaned back slightly in the chair and stared toward the dark hills rolling beneath the clouds. "Because I stopped giving them reasons to." Nayeli watched him quietly. Elias almost smiled at that. She asked questions the same way wounded animals approached water. Slowly, ready to run. "My wife died 12 years ago," he said after a long pause. "Fever came through Black Creek. Took half the town before winter ended." Wind moved softly through the porch rails while he spoke. "After that, folks expected me to become somebody different. Angry maybe, meaner. But grief does not always make noise. Sometimes it just empties a man out." Nayeli lowered her eyes toward her hands beneath the blanket. "In my tribe," she whispered, "people believed pain should be carried together." Elias nodded once. "White towns are not always built that way." Another silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with things neither person fully knew how to say. Then Elias noticed her hands trembling slightly again. Fever. He could see it now in the faint flush beneath her skin. Nayeli tried to hide it by pulling the blanket tighter around herself, but a sudden shiver betrayed her anyway. Elias stood. "Immediately. You are getting cold." "I am fine." "No, he said quietly. You are not. He disappeared briefly inside the cabin before returning with another wool blanket and a steaming tin cup filled with cedar tea. Nayeli accepted it slowly, though her fingers brushed his hand longer this time before pulling away. Small things mattered out here. Tiny moments people in cities would never notice. Elias sat back down while dusk deepened across the valley. The old rider, he said carefully. He is still looking for you. Nayeli stared into the steam rising from the cup. Men like him never stop looking. Why? Her expression darkened slightly, though not with anger. Sadness. Old sadness. Because some people cannot bear seeing what they failed to destroy. Elias felt those words settle deep inside him. Before he could answer, Nayeli suddenly winced sharply and leaned forward, one hand pressing hard beneath the blanket near her ribs. The cup slipped from her fingers and struck the porch floor with a dull metal sound. Elias moved instantly toward her. Nayeli. She tried to push herself upright, but the strength vanished from her arms almost immediately. Her breathing turned shallow while color drained from her face beneath the fading light. Do not, she whispered weakly as Elias reached for the blanket around her shoulders. Fear flashed through her eyes again. Not fear of pain, fear of being seen. Elias stopped for one brief second, caught between respecting her silence and saving her life. Then he noticed dark stains slowly spreading through the edge of the blanket near her side. Old wounds had opened again. The blanket slipped from Nayeli's shoulders before she could stop it, and for one brief second the evening wind moved across skin covered in old scars pale as dried riverbeds beneath the fading light. Elias Mercer froze where he knelt beside her. Not because of the marks themselves. Frontier life taught people quickly that pain came in many forms. No, what struck him was the silence behind them. The terrible silence of someone who had carried suffering for so long it no longer surprised her. Nayeli tried to pull the blanket back, but weakness stole the strength from her arms. Elias caught the fabric gently before it fell completely away and wrapped it back around her shoulders without a word. Then he lifted her carefully from the porch. She stiffened immediately in his arms, panic flashing across her fevered face. Do not, she whispered weakly. Please. Elias carried her through the cabin door while lantern light trembled against the wooden walls. You are bleeding, he said quietly. That matters more right now. He laid her carefully on the narrow bed near the stove while wind rattled softly outside. For several seconds Nayeli kept her eyes turned away from him entirely, breathing uneven beneath the blanket like someone bracing for humiliation instead of help. Elias moved slowly around the room gathering clean cloth, boiled water, and the small wooden box holding the last of his medicine supplies. The entire time, he never once looked directly at the scars beneath the blanket. That mattered more to her than he realized. You do not have to hide from me, he said finally while kneeling beside the bed. Nayeli let out a faint laugh that sounded closer to heartbreak than humor. You say that now. Elias soaked a cloth in warm water and carefully handed it to her instead of reaching himself. Then let me earn the right to keep saying it. Silence settled between them again while firelight moved softly across the cabin ceiling. After a long moment, Nayeli slowly loosened her grip on the blanket just enough to press the cloth against her side. Elias turned his eyes respectfully toward the floorboards while she adjusted the fabric. Tiny gestures, tiny mercies. Sometimes dignity lived inside the smallest things. The old rider, Elias said quietly after a while. What did he mean when he called you a ghost? Nayeli stared into the fire beside the bed. Because everybody else from that place is dead. The words hung heavily in the room. Elias did not interrupt. He had learned grief speaks only when it chooses to. Nayeli swallowed hard before continuing. There was a camp south of Fort Yuma years ago. Women, children, prisoners from tribes the army wanted moved farther west. Her fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. One winter, a fire started during a storm. Some say it was an accident. Others said the soldiers locked the gates too slowly. Elias listened in complete silence while wind hissed through the cracks in the cabin walls. My daughter was inside, Nayeli whispered. The room suddenly felt colder despite the stove burning hot beside them. Elias lowered his eyes toward his rough hands resting against his knees. Nothing he could say would survive beside a sentence like that. Nayeli reached slowly beneath the pillow and pulled out the burned wedding ring wrapped in black cloth. Firelight reflected softly against the dark metal. This was all they found afterward. Her voice trembled now despite every effort to keep it steady. I buried it in the desert because I thought if I stopped carrying it, maybe I could stop carrying everything else too. Elias stared quietly at the small ring resting in her palm. Out beyond the cabin walls, coyotes called somewhere across the valley while cold wind rolled through cedar trees beneath the moonlight. Finally, Elias spoke. Pain does not disappear because you bury it. Naeli looked at him then, eyes shining faintly in the firelight. No, she whispered. But sometimes you get tired of carrying it alone. Elias reached toward the table beside the bed and gently placed the lantern lower so the light softened across the room instead of exposing her scars. That simple movement broke something inside her stronger than anger ever could. Because for the first time in many years, a man had looked at her wounds and chosen kindness instead of curiosity. The next 3 days passed beneath low winter skies and a silence that no longer felt empty inside Elias Mercer's cabin. Snow gathered lightly across the hills during the nights, dusting the cedar trees and fence posts in pale silver, while cold wind rolled down from the mountains strong enough to shake the shutters after dark. Naeli grew stronger slowly. The fever faded first, then the shaking in her hands disappeared. But some wounds healed differently than others. Elias noticed she still avoided mirrors, still turned her face whenever strangers passed near the ranch road below. Some mornings he would find her sitting alone beside the horse barn before sunrise, staring east toward the desert while holding that burned wedding ring tightly between both hands. Like she feared the dead could vanish completely if she loosened her grip. Elias never interrupted those moments. Grief deserved privacy the same way prayer did. One evening, near sundown, Elias returned from repairing the north fence line and found smoke curling from the cabin chimney along with the faint smell of stew drifting through the cold air. He paused halfway across the yard, surprised by how unfamiliar comfort felt after so many years alone. Inside, lantern light glowed softly against the wooden walls while Naeli stood near the stove stirring a pot with slow, careful movements. Her dark hair rested loosely over one shoulder now instead of hiding completely beneath the blanket she once refused to remove. Small changes, quiet ones, but Elias noticed all of them. Naeli glanced toward him as he entered. You were gone longer today. Elias removed his gloves near the door. Fence posts froze deeper than expected. She nodded slightly before returning her attention to the stove. I thought perhaps the riders came back. Elias looked at her carefully then. The fear in her voice had changed over the past days. Softer now, less like panic, more like exhaustion from waiting for something inevitable. If they do, he said quietly, they will find me first. Naeli lowered the spoon slowly. You should not make enemies for somebody like me. Elias hung his coat beside the lantern. Too late for that. For the first time, an actual smile touched the corner of her mouth. Brief, fragile, gone almost immediately, but real. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats again. Slow this time. Deliberate. Elias turned toward the window instantly, while Naeli stiffened near the stove. Outside, dusk shadows stretched long across the snow-covered valley as a single rider approached through the fading light. Not the old bounty hunter. Someone else. Elias opened the cabin door before the rider reached the porch. The man dismounted heavily near the fence, boots crunching through thin snow. He wore a dark cavalry coat faded by years and weather, though the brass buttons still caught the last of the evening light. Older than Elias by perhaps 15 years. Broad shoulders, gray mustache, eyes too cold for a man arriving peacefully. The rider removed his gloves slowly while studying the cabin behind Elias. You Mercer? Elias nodded once. Who was asking? The man reached into his coat and removed a silver flask before speaking. Name is Colonel Nathaniel Royce. Retired. He drank once before continuing. I am looking for an Apache woman traveling alone. Behind Elias, the cabin floor creaked softly. Naeli had stepped closer without meaning to. Royce heard it too. His eyes lifted immediately toward the doorway. Then something changed in his face. Recognition. Well, he muttered quietly. I suppose rumors were true after all. Elias stepped slightly sideways, blocking the entrance. You rode a long way for rumors. Royce smiled faintly, though the expression carried no warmth. Some ghosts are difficult to forget. Wind hissed softly across the yard while darkness settled deeper over the ranch. Naeli stood completely still behind Elias now, one hand trembling lightly against the edge of the table. Royce noticed. Elias saw him notice. And suddenly the entire valley felt too quiet. "You should leave," Elias said calmly. Royce ignored him. His eyes remained fixed somewhere past Elias into the cabin shadows. "You know," the colonel said softly, "there was a time that woman could not look anybody in the eye without shaking." Naeli's breathing faltered behind him. Elias felt it without turning around. Royce took another slow step forward through the snow. Funny how survivors always pretend they are stronger than they really are. Then, from behind Elias, Naeli finally spoke. Her voice shook slightly, but the fear inside it was beginning to sound different now. "Harder. And funny," she whispered. "How cowards always return after the fire is over." The words settled over the snowy ranch yard like the beginning of another storm. Colonel Nathaniel Royce stood motionless beside his horse while cold wind dragged loose snow across the ground between him and the cabin porch. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Elias Mercer could feel Naeli standing behind him, close enough that he heard the slight shake in her breathing. But something had changed inside that voice now. The fear was still there. Fear like old scars never fully disappeared. But beneath it lived something else. Anger. Royce removed his glove slowly, eyes never leaving the cabin doorway. "You always did have a sharp tongue," he said quietly. Naeli stepped forward before Elias could stop her. Firelight spilled softly across her face from inside the cabin, catching the dark circles beneath her eyes and the exhaustion she no longer bothered hiding. But she stood straighter now than the woman Elias had dragged half-conscious from the desert days earlier. "And you always preferred silence," she answered, "especially when people needed help." Royce looked away briefly toward the snow-covered hills. Strange thing about guilty men. Sometimes they spent years rehearsing excuses only to discover they sounded hollow once spoken aloud. "That camp was chaos," he muttered. "The storm, the fire, the panic. Men were trying to survive." Naeli's expression hardened. Children were trying to survive. Wind moved softly through the cedar trees behind the barn, while somewhere out in the darkness a horse stamped against frozen ground. Elias watched Royce carefully now. The old colonel carried himself like a man who had once commanded others easily. But the confidence was thinning around the edges. Naeli's presence unsettled him more than he expected. Maybe because dead memories were easier to carry than living witnesses. Royce cleared his throat and reached slowly into his coat pocket. Elias' hand drifted near his revolver immediately, but the old man only removed a folded piece of paper worn soft from years of handling. "I came because of this," Royce said quietly. He held the paper toward Naeli without stepping closer. "After the fire, we found records. Names of prisoners transferred before winter. Your daughter's name was not listed among the dead." Silence hit the porch harder than thunder. Naeli stared at him without moving. Even Elias stopped breathing for half a second. Royce lowered the paper slightly. "For years I thought maybe the records were wrong," he continued. "Then last month, a trader near New Mexico claimed he saw a young Apache woman carrying a silver ring burned black around the edges." Naeli's fingers instinctively tightened around the ring hanging beneath her blanket. Elias noticed immediately. Royce saw it too. "You think she survived?" Naeli whispered. The old colonel shook his head slowly. "I do not know." That honesty sounded heavier than lies. Snow drifted softly through the yard, while lantern light flickered behind the cabin windows. Naeli stepped farther onto the porch now, close enough that moonlight touched the scars near her collarbone she had spent years hiding from the world. Royce noticed them instantly. His face changed. Not disgust, not fear. Shame. Deep enough to bend a man quieter than age ever could. "You looked away that night," Naeli said softly. "I remember that part most." Royce lowered his eyes toward the snow. "I was a coward." The admission barely rose above the wind. Elias had expected excuses. Men usually protected themselves long after truth stopped mattering. But Royce looked tired now, old in a way that had nothing to do with gray hair. Naeli studied him silently while cold air moved around them. Then, slowly, she pulled the blanket lower from her shoulders, revealing the scars she had hidden beneath cloth and darkness since arriving at the ranch. Elias looked away instinctively to give her dignity. Royce could not. His eyes filled with something close to grief as the truth stood before him under the winter moon. "This," Naeli whispered, "is what silence leaves behind." The old colonel removed his hat slowly, snow collecting in his gray hair, while he stared at the ground, like a man no longer certain he deserved to stand beneath the sky. Then he reached into his coat one final time and held out a small silver pendant shaped like a rising sun. "The traitor gave me this," he said quietly. He claimed the young woman wore another just like it. Naeli's breath caught instantly, because hanging beneath her blanket, hidden against her chest for years, rested its matching half. The silver pendant trembled slightly in Colonel Royce's weathered hand while snow drifted across the ranch yard in slow, quiet spirals. Naeli stared at the small piece of metal like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. Her breathing had gone shallow again, but not from fear this time. Hope could shake a person harder than terror ever did. Slowly, almost carefully, she reached beneath the blanket around her shoulders and pulled free the second pendant hanging from a worn leather cord around her neck. Firelight spilled softly across the silver surface, revealing identical markings etched along both halves of the rising sun. Royce looked down at the matching pieces and closed his eyes briefly, like a man finally forced to stand before every mistake he ever buried. "The traitor said the young woman carried this one since childhood," he said quietly. "He met her near Santa Fe 2 months ago." Naeli's fingers tightened around the pendant resting in her palm. "Did he tell you her name?" Royce shook his head slowly. "Only that she worked in a church kitchen outside the city. Apache girl. Around 19 years old." 19. The number struck the cold night air like church bells across an empty valley. Elias Mercer watched Naeli carefully as tears finally filled her eyes for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Not loud tears, not dramatic ones, just quiet grief softening into something fragile enough to resemble hope again. She lowered herself slowly onto the porch steps, as though her legs no longer trusted the ground beneath them. Snowflakes landed silently in her dark hair while she stared at the matching pendants resting side by side in her hands. "All these years," she whispered, "I thought I buried everybody." Elias remained beside the doorway, giving her space the same way he always had. Some moments were too sacred for questions. Colonel Royce removed his hat fully now, holding it awkwardly against his chest while cold wind moved through the yard. "I cannot undo what happened," he said. "There are not enough years left in my life for that." His voice sounded smaller than before. "Human now. But if there is even a chance your daughter survived, you deserve to know." Naeli slowly lifted her eyes toward him. The anger remained there, buried deep beneath old scars and old memories. But something else stood beside it now. Exhaustion. Mercy sometimes arrived looking very similar to exhaustion. "Why help me now?" she asked softly. Royce stared toward the snowy mountains beyond the ranch fence. "Because every night since that winter, I remembered the sound of mothers calling for children inside that smoke." His jaw tightened briefly. "And because cowardice grows heavier when a man gets old." Silence settled over the porch again, while the wind carried distant coyote calls across the valley below. Then Naeli did something Elias did not expect. She stood slowly and walked toward the old colonel until only a few feet separated them in the snow. Royce could barely meet her eyes anymore. Not after seeing the scars. Not after hearing her voice survive despite everything meant to silence it. Naeli looked at him quietly for several seconds before speaking. "You cannot change the past," she said. "But you finally looked at it." The old man lowered his head once. It was not forgiveness. Some wounds lived deeper than words could reach. But it was enough to let the night breathe again. Royce mounted his horse a few minutes later beneath the pale moonlight. Before riding away, he handed Elias a folded piece of paper containing the church address near Santa Fe. Then he disappeared slowly into the snowy darkness without another word. Long after the hoofbeats faded, Naeli remained standing at the porch railing staring south toward the distant desert beyond the mountains. Elias stepped beside her quietly, his coat brushing softly against the winter wind. "You thinking about leaving?" he asked. Naeli touched the pendant near her chest. "For the first time in years," she whispered, "I am thinking about arriving somewhere." Elias looked out across the valley where fresh snow covered every scar the land carried beneath it. Then, without speaking, he removed the small cracked mirror hanging beside the cabin door and gently placed it into Naeli's hands. She stared down at her reflection beneath the moonlight. The scars were still there. The grief was still there too. But for the first time in many years, she did not look away from